Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for the 10th of September, Wednesday, where I wanted to finish up talking about the syllabus and begin talking about some of the introductory readings that I had assigned for today, though I'm well aware that you may not necessarily have had a chance to get all of the textbooks, and that leads me to the syllabus. If you'll remember on the syllabus, I had indicated that you could use any edition of the text that you would like. And I also have been able to find online links for all of these texts. So if you look at the notes below under the first section, you'll see all of the links to the texts that I've assigned. And the first is Danse Macabre, and then Supernatural Horror and Literature. Then we move to Frankenstein, and then the short stories that we're reading from Edgar Allan Poe, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. There's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula. Lovecraft's short stories, and the ones that we will be reading this semester are The Outsider, Pickman's Model, and The Dunwich Horror. The Haunting of Hill House, The Exorcist, and then finally, Night Shift, the foreword of Night Shift, as well as two short stories, Jerusalem's Lot and One for the Road. I don't ask questions about copyright. I just know that I was able to find these links, and these links were active at least during this past weekend. So, in terms of the texts that we're going to be reading this semester, I had deliberately started with introductory material to set the stage, if you will, before we actually get into some of the Gothic texts. But before I start talking about what I had assigned for today from Danse Macabre, I just wanted to indicate that I'm not using the grading program in Moodle. So if you look at the grading program and it seems odd to you what your grade is, that's because I'm not using it. So just contact me if you ever want to see your grade. And I will be retiring the previous week's class in our past class sessions. You'll see that next week. And I wanted to talk a little bit about plagiarism. And in terms of plagiarism, it used to be a fairly easy conversation where it's basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. So as long as you acknowledge where you're getting it from, whatever that it happens to be, then you're not plagiarizing. And if you do plagiarize, it's a pretty serious academic offense, so much so that you could actually be expelled from the college with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. And there are many different ways to plagiarize, many different ways for teachers to figure out if students are plagiarizing. And I always used to tell two stories. Notice I'm using the past tense here about plagiarism to encourage students not to plagiarize. And the first happened to me early in my career. So this would have been in the early 1990s, where I was reading a paper that sounded familiar. And I couldn't go to the internet to investigate, but I didn't need to, because after I thought about it a little bit, I realized that the reason why the student's paper sounded familiar is because there were direct passages taken from our class textbook, with a few mechanical errors here and there. So I don't know if that was deliberate to mislead me or if that was just sloppy plagiarism. But the better story occurred around the same time, not to me, but to a middle-aged professor. That part important. And this story appeared in all the academic newspapers. And yes, it was so unusual that it did appear in academic newspapers. And this middle-aged professor had been teaching for quite a while, was reading a set of papers, again, pre-internet times, and realized that a paper sounded familiar. And as he wondered where had he read this before, he quickly realized he hadn't read it, he had written it. It was one of his old college papers from decades earlier when he was a college student. And I don't know all the specifics. It has something to do with a fraternity that was recycling papers from previous fraternity members. What are the odds of something like that happening? But the game has changed dramatically with artificial intelligence. And this is my opportunity to encourage you not to use artificial intelligence, at least in this class. Certainly, it has its time and its place, and there are multiple reasons actually why I feel this way. And one is, of course, if you happen to be a conspiracy theorist and you're thinking that artificial intelligence is just an opportunity for some entity to take over the world, and if you are a fan of the Terminator film series, you know that once computers become sentient and self-aware, that it's not a good um, future for humanity. That said, I have much more pressing reasons, I think. And the first actually is the ethical issues surrounding artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence programs are basically using the knowledge created by humans, but those humans aren't getting credit for the knowledge that artificial intelligence is using, which leads to a whole host of problems for all of the writers and the artists, and all of the other individuals who have created knowledge that is on the internet that artificial intelligence is using. The second is environmental, which I don't think is spoken about often enough. Artificial intelligence takes a lot of resources, a lot of water, and I worry about the state of the planet, to be quite honest. Third issue that I have with artificial intelligence is its speed. So, if you know your history, you know that the Industrial Revolution just changed the world. But that happened over a long period of time. Artificial intelligence is changing the world in a short period of time. And for better or worse, the artificial intelligence that will exist at the ending of this semester will be very different than the artificial intelligence that exists now at the beginning of the semester. And the language that I've heard is quite interesting, that the artificial intelligence has a tendency to, quote, hallucinate, unquote, which I find worrisome because that seems to imply some level of self awareness. And the idea is that the information isn't always accurate. And in fact, sometimes the information is completely fictional. And there are certainly enough stories of professionals who have used artificial intelligence, lawyers, for instance, to find that the artificial intelligence has given them court case precedents, for instance, and for court cases that never existed, as judges found out when they did a little bit of their own research. And when you put all of those things together, this is my plea not to use artificial intelligence in this class, that while it would be quite lovely if you understood the history of Gothic literature, my goal is a little bit grander. It's to encourage thinking. And because of artificial intelligence, I've actually changed some of the assignments in this class. For instance, your class discussion form is worth a large portion of your grade, 25%. And that's deliberate because I really want you to think. I've often said that the difference between high school and college is that high school teaches you about what, college is an attempt to examine why. So when we read these texts, yes, we'll talk about what happened, the plot. But much more importantly is, why did those things happen? That's the beauty of the study of literature, is that it really encourages you to interpret and to analyze and to examine the human condition, because all of these stories are based on our common humanity in one fashion or another. So that's my explanation, and I believe I mentioned that I teach media classes. And in my previous media class, I had a student who sent me a video about actually social media. And I think it's also applicable to artificial intelligence. And it's about the idea that we don't have nearly as much control as we think we do when we're utilizing these resources. And he makes some interesting analogies with actually fast food. And I believe it's worth watching. It's 14 minutes long, and you can see it in the notes below underneath the plagiarism section. So I encourage you to watch it because I think he makes some really valid points. And every time he says social media, you could just substitute it for artificial intelligence. But onwards and upwards to the text material. And you can see that what I've done is I have given you, as I said, all of the links that you would need. And the link for Danse Macabre will give you an idea of Stephen King's writing style. If you haven't had a chance to read Danse Macabre in its hard copy form, is very informal, very colloquial. Stephen King is very well versed in literature. In fact, he was an English teacher at one point, and he has earned his reputation for his horror novels, and horror basically is the child, if you will, of Gothic literature. So Danse Macabre is a little bit different from his other texts because he usually writes fiction, and Danse Macabre happens to be a historical overview of the ideas associated with horror and with Gothic. So I wanted to assign that as an introductory reading before we actually start reading some Gothic text so that we can have a bit of foundation. And it begins with probably the title of the novel, Danse Macabre, which is a medieval term, and it means dance of death. That death is universal, and there can be this kind of artistic element associated with it. And if you look in the notes below in the third section, in the second point, there is a woodcut image. And if you were to click on that link, what you will see are the dancing skeletons, the idea that death is involved in a kind of dance, a kind of macabre dance. King argues that death is ultimately the biggest unknown and our biggest fear. And one way or another, it comes back to death. And that these texts that we read examine our fear of death. And he has 3 levels that he differentiates these texts into. 3 levels of horror, or 3 levels of Gothic. The first being the gross out, which is basically meant to be filled with revulsion. It's the lowest level and probably the least interesting in terms from an academic perspective. It's the most manipulative. Though he says he's not proud and he doesn't mind using this. The mid-level is what he calls the creeps. This is where we feel anxiety. We begin to see some things that are filled with gross out, but not necessarily entirely dependent on that. And then the highest level would be terror, which is implied and suggested. You don't really see anything. It's your imagination that fills in the blanks, because your imagination is much more powerful than anything any writer or film director could offer. If you've ever been alone at home and you've heard a noise and you wonder if you've locked the door, you know how frightening that can be, much more so than seeing the tentacled monster on the film screen. So this fear of disestablishment is what King talks about in terms of terror. And that horror, even though it's much maligned, has its origins in a tradition called Gothic that is quite literary and that also is symbolic. It's representational. So while we're reading something, and it certainly can be read from its literal perspective, it also is suggesting something beyond the literal. So we oftentimes talk about symbolism in literature classes where you've got something usually that's concrete that represents something that's not concrete. Take a flag, for instance. A flag is a concrete object that's supposed to represent patriotism, which is not necessarily something you've known your entire life, though it might seem like it. You were taught this at one point or another. Some symbols are not quite as obvious, and oftentimes authors will engage in those symbols. And Stephen King talks about that the finest levels of horror, that which is implied and suggested, is oftentimes symbolic or allegorical. It's representational. So while we're talking about a specific fear, let's say a fear of a particular monster, it represents a more universal fear that we experience as humanity. It could be a political fear. It could be an economic fear. It could be a psychological fear, or all of the above. And this idea that what we can do is experience this fear in a safe way so that we can have, and this term might be familiar if you're taking psychology classes, catharsis. It's a purging of emotion. It's the reason why some people like to ride the roller coaster, is because they like the adrenaline rush, and they know that generally speaking the roller coaster ride is going to be safe. That kind of adrenaline rush in an out of control car would not be pleasurable, but for many people it is pleasurable on a roller coaster. And in terms of being scared, it's something that most people would think they want to avoid, and yet there are a group of people like myself, and perhaps you as well, that welcome this idea of being scared in a safe way, and that's why we read and watch Gothic and horror. So the next chapter that I had assigned, and that's called Tales of the Hook in chapter 2. This is in the 4th section in the notes below. You might know about that very basic story, Tales of the Hook, about how there is a young couple who is out on a romantic evening in their car, and it turns out that there is a mass murderer that's on the loose, and this person has a hook for a hand, and while the ending suggests that basically they've just narrowly escaped death, that that person with the hook was after them, and that if they hadn't have left that parking spot immediately, they would have been the next victim. And the reason why is because there is a scratch mark, and sometimes, depending on how the story is told, even a hook that is attached to the car. So it's nothing that is necessarily given in detail, but it's a basic enough story that it works on a nice level to scare people on things like summer camps. And Stephen King uses that tale to talk about the most basic of horror stories, but that we see much more complexity in the stories that we talk about in the tradition of Gothic or horror. And that there's oftentimes a lot of genre blending, that we talk about horror, but it can be very closely related to science fiction. And sometimes the two will straddle one another. So take something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which we will be reading, which seems to have elements of science fiction associated with it, but I would also suggest that it has elements of horror or Gothic or supernatural associated with it. And science fiction is just something that has not occurred yet through scientific discovery, but could occur through scientific discovery. That said, we also have fantasy, and fantasy is the creation of a completely new world. So if you know Tolkien, for instance, a completely new environment. Gothic, which I'll talk a little bit more about soon, it has its origins from the 1800s with literary texts, and that has basically morphed into what we think of as horror. It's often maligned, it's often misunderstood, it's often seen as lowbrow. But that said, there are good texts and there are bad texts. We're going to be focusing on the good texts. And according to King, there's a cyclical popularity associated with it. So that ultimately, as we go through generational anxieties, those anxieties are reflected in the popularity of the new cyclical element associated with horror. In fact, I was just reading an article saying that there seems to be this renaissance of horror film in the last year or so. And that one of the attractions of horror is that it allows us to engage in the deviant, and to do so again in a safe way. One of my favorite texts, I Am Legend, by Richard Matheson, talks about how normality is a sociological concept that is based on the majority, that normality is a majority concept. And I think that works very nicely when we think about the idea of monstrosity. And in Latin, monstrare means to show or reveal. And I think what we have are these monsters that are showing or revealing elements of ourselves, oftentimes that are monstrous. So sometimes the true monster is within ourselves. And usually these tales according to King, and I agree, are rather conservative because they reestablish the status quo where good prevails and evil is vanquished. Now, in the third chapter that I had assigned, Tales of the Tarot cards are cards that are used in a way to try to tell the future or perhaps to learn more about the past from a supernatural or spiritual perspective. That particular chapter talks about how, again, these tales more often than not are morality tales. And in fact, morality tales go all the way back to the origins of medieval drama in England, where biblical stories were basically dramatized. Yes, for entertainment, but also for their instructional element. Now, if you think about some of the big names in Gothic and horror, names like Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, then you probably know that these iconic texts are iconic in part because of film. The two are closely intertwined with one another, which is why we're going to be talking about film. And if you're interested in the subject, I even teach an entire class in horror film. But according to King, these three major images in horror are basically archetypal. That Frankenstein just represents some monstrosity, something that can't be defined. That anything that is vampiric, that lives off of the life force of another, that's Dracula. And anything that can transform itself into something else is a kind of werewolf or a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And while those are external horrors, the internal horrors, in other words, how humanity deals with these external horrors, can sometimes be much more horrific. But the idea of horror goes all the way back to the literary tradition of things like Beowulf, when you want to think about Grendel's mother, or if you want to think about the Renaissance, how about Shakespeare's Macbeth, where we've got our witches as supernatural entities? So this idea of Gothic is an architectural term. So you might know about Gothic cathedrals with these with these huge spires and so forth, these pointed arches. And at the time, it was viewed as a rather grotesque kind of architectural form, excessive, if you will, though now it's viewed as something that is quite beautiful. And there also is a historical element associated with the Gothic. So if you know anything about the Goths, which were German conquerors that were known for their barbaric practices. So that's where the term comes from, Gothic, and it was associated with that which was considered to be barbaric and excessive. What's considered to be the first Gothic novel was written actually in 1764. And this was by Horace Walpole, and it's entitled The Castle of Otranto. And if you look in the notes below, I've got the link for the book, The Castle of Otranto. Not that I expect you to read it, but if you ever wanted to look at it, you certainly could. I'm the first to admit that it is a poorly written book, and part of it has to do with what is seemingly a supernatural helmet that falls out of the sky. The reason why the Castle of Otranto is so important, however, is because it helped to establish the Gothic tradition that was embraced in the 1800s by the Frankensteins and Draculas and Dr. Jekylls and Mr. Hydes of the day. So some of the conventions that were established, things like secret passageways, mystery, death, and a little factoid that we'll talk about with Poe when we get to Edgar Allan Poe, is that Edgar Allan Poe created the first modern day mystery story in the way that we think of mystery stories. Death, decay, distress, victimization, omens and curses, nightmares, eerie atmosphere. A lot of it is atmospheric. There is a specific reason why I teach this class in the fall, and it's because of Halloween. It's the appropriate atmosphere. And if you know anything at all about a Halloween party, you know a lot of it is about establishing atmosphere. Possible supernatural activity, that which defies the natural order, that cannot be duplicated through science. And that said, there's ambiguity involved. In other words, it's unclear. So if you don't want to embrace a supernatural explanation, you oftentimes, as a reader or a viewer, are given an out, if you will, by having another possibility. And there also is a lot of doubling. If you've ever heard of the term doppelganger, which is an idea that we all have a double, you'll see lots of doubles, sometimes even triples in all of these stories as well. So, as I had indicated, its heyday was in 1800s Europe. So, we're going to spend a good amount of time with 1800s Europe, but we will work our way to some more contemporary texts. Now, for our next class, I had another introductory reading for us to do. It's a very long essay, so it seems like it's a book, but it's not. Written by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, H.P. Lovecraft is also a major name in the Gothic and horror tradition, and he existed before Stephen King, so Stephen King was very well aware of H.P. Lovecraft. And H.P. Lovecraft's writing style is the exact opposite of Stephen King's. While Stephen King is chatty and he's informal, Lovecraft is very academic, very much an Anglophile, very much supporting the idea of the affectations of the British. And it is a very dense essay to read. So I tell you this so that you don't panic when you go through this particular essay. You don't necessarily have to understand all of it. One of the things you will see is that H.P. Lovecraft is also incredibly well read. That's not to say that Stephen King isn't incredibly well read, but Stephen King doesn't necessarily name drop in the way that H.P. Lovecraft does. And in fact, he mentions names of texts and authors that I've never read. So you don't necessarily have to understand all of the references that he's making in his essay. And he actually is making many of the same claims that Stephen King is. And remember that Stephen King would have been influenced by H.P. Lovecraft. But I wanted you to read his essay because it's considered to be the definitive essay about Gothic and horror. And it's entitled Supernatural Horror and Literature. So Lovecraft talks a little bit about his perceptions of what makes something supernatural horror. And he talks quite a bit about his fondness for Edgar Allan Poe, who is a very famous Gothic author. So that is what we will talk about next class. And then we will go into our first Gothic text, which happens to be Frankenstein. And I've put these texts in chronological order so that you can see a progression throughout the course of the semester. Now, we'll have about a couple of weeks devoted to Frankenstein. And I can tell you that in an ideal world, and I'm aware that the world isn't always ideal, in an ideal world, you would have read Frankenstein in its entirety. In other words, that you're reading it now, so that when we begin to talk about it in our first class, you would have read the novel as a whole. And while we're talking about Frankenstein, you're doing the next set of readings. That would be ideal, but again, you do the best you can with what you can. And ultimately, when we talk about Frankenstein, we have to talk about film. So that'll be part of our conversations, is watching the iconic Frankenstein as well. But I just wanted to give you a fair warning that we are moving away from our introductory piece of the semester after we finish H.P. Lovecraft, and then we're moving to actually reading some of the Gothic texts, some of the texts that King and Lovecraft talk about. Obviously, we can't read all of the texts that King and Lovecraft talk about, but certainly those that are considered to be the most iconic, we will be reading over the course of the semester, and also talking about the influence of film in our understanding of these particular texts. So, as you can see, I've given you the link for Frankenstein and the link for everything else as well. It's always a good idea to get ahead in your reading because you really don't know what life is going to be in another few weeks. So if it turns out that you can't necessarily devote as much attention to class as you would like, if you're ahead, then you're not playing catch up. So I always recommend that. So where we are for today is our discussion form response. And you'll remember that in our last class, your discussion form response was for you to introduce yourself to the class. So I wanted to introduce myself to you, that I was born and raised in New York City. And I attended college in upstate New York. the University of Rochester, and this school advertised itself as a place where students could experience, quote, real winters, unquote. I had no idea what that meant until I got there, and then I realized it meant that it snowed starting in October. Pretty much didn't end until April. But regardless of the inclement weather, I still had a good experience where I was majoring in English and minoring in psychology because I was absolutely positively certain I was going to be a lawyer. So if you're absolutely positively certain about something in your academic career, things change as you are continue to be exposed to new pieces of information and knowledge. I was exposed to Shakespeare, and that changed my trajectory. And now I knew I didn't want to be a lawyer. What I really wanted to do was to talk about literature, specifically Shakespeare and his contemporaries. So instead of going to law school, I went to graduate school and I focused on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And when I picked my graduate school, I made sure that my graduate school did not have real winters. So I found a school in sunny Southern California, UCLA to be exact. And no, there was no snowfall. There were mudslides, there were all kinds of other issues associated with weather, but there were no major snowstorms. Nevertheless, once I finished up with my degree and began teaching, I realized that I was starting to miss winter after all. So I decided to return to the East Coast and I began applying to positions. Anything on the East Coast would be a possibility for me to satisfy my desire to return home. And there was a little school by the name of Greenfield Community College that had an opening. So you know how the story ends in a community called Greenfield, Massachusetts. And I ended up applying and was asked out for an interview. And I never heard of the place before, but I liked what I saw. And I remember talking a little bit with my interview committee about what my transition might be like if I left sunny California to come to Massachusetts. But as my interview committee told me, the winters here in Massachusetts are, quote, not that bad, unquote. Now, this would have been in 1993, which was a historical year because in 1993, we broke most of the existing records for snowfall and ice and cold. So it was a particularly brutal winter, and I was completely unprepared. Nevertheless, I stayed, and I've been through all kinds of winters and other weather since. And as I had indicated in my last class, I mostly teach English classes, but over the years I've branched out to public speaking and media, so I have a lot of different tastes. So that's a little bit about my background. And for today's attendance question, what I'm going to be asking you to do is to respond to the question of what frightens you and why. The why is really the most important thing. And note that this is an opinion question. I oftentimes like to ask opinion questions so that you don't necessarily have to have a right or wrong answer. It's more about your reasoning. But since we've been talking about fear with Stephen King and we will be talking about fear with Lovecraft, it seemed like a good thing for us to talk about. And as I indicated with the discussion forums, you would have 48 hours to do your discussion forum or to complete your discussion forum question. So this will be due Friday on the 12th. And if you need additional time, just please ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it to you. And you are not required to respond to your peers when they give their discussion forum responses. Though certainly you're encouraged to. Much like in a face-to-face class, you might be encouraged to raise your hand and to give commentary to someone's comment. But you're not required to. I'm well aware that some people are much more quiet, some people are much more vocal. Same thing with the discussion forum. You're not required to respond to your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to. What you are required to do is to read all of your peer responses and my responses in turn. As you will see, I will be responding to all of you. That'll give you a good idea what the class discussion would have been like if we were in a face-to-face class. And you don't need to start a new thread, by the way, when you are answering the discussion forum questions. So, with that said, we will continue on next class talking about Lovecraft. I encourage you to watch that video about social media, which I think has a lot of relevance to artificial intelligence. I hope you're doing well. The video is about 14 minutes long, by the way, if you're curious. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Lovecraft. Take care. Bye-bye.